Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a stroll back in time to ancient Mesopotamia, where the air is thick with the aroma of barley, and the streets are alive with the hum of merchants, priests, and brewers. This isn't just any night. We're uncovering the story of beer, that fizzy, golden nectar that started its humble journey in the dusty plains of Sumer. Imagine, if you will, trudging along a winding dirt road under a sky streaked with the last rays of the setting sun, a clay mug in your hand filled with a foamy drink that tastes earthy, yeasty, and a little sour. Now, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Are you nestled in bed at midnight or listening to this on your lunch break? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Beer is one of those quiet marvels of history. It doesn't shout like the Great Pyramids or glitter like a golden sarcophagus, but it's always been there, bubbling away in the background. For the ancient Sumerians, beer wasn't just a drink, it was a way of life. They called it kaz, a word that rippled through their culture, signifying nourishment, community, and even divine favor. Our journey begins nearly 6,000 years ago, in the heart of the Fertile Crescent, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers wove through lush plains and rolling fields of barley and emmer wheat. Picture bustling villages where men and women in long, flowing robes worked side by side, threshing grain under the blazing sun. That grain was the foundation of their civilization, food, trade, and, most intriguingly, beer. The Sumerians were not the first to farm grain, but they were among the first to unlock its full potential. Barley was their staple crop, hardy enough to withstand Mesopotamia's unpredictable climate. But barley alone wasn't particularly exciting. It was when they left it soaking in water, perhaps forgotten in the corner of a sunlit storeroom, that something magical happened. The water mixed with airborne yeast, fermentation began, and the first beer, primitive, unfiltered, and probably closer to porridge than Pilsner, was born. Now, here's a fun thought experiment. Imagine being that first Sumerian who dared to taste this odd, frothy concoction. Was it bravery, curiosity, or just hunger? Whatever their motive, they discovered something extraordinary. Beer was not only drinkable but deeply satisfying. It quenched thirst, provided calories, and had a mildly intoxicating effect that turned long, hard days into evenings of laughter and song. But it wasn't all fun and froth. Beer was a practical solution to a pressing problem. Clean drinking water was notoriously hard to come by in ancient Mesopotamia. The rivers that gave life to their crops also carried silt, parasites, and other nasties that could make you sick. Beer, with its alcohol content and brewing process, was a much safer option. It became the drink of choice for Sumerians of all ages, from sturdy farmers to high priests offering libations to their gods. Interestingly, the Sumerians thought of beer as liquid bread. The same grains that fed their families could be transformed into this nourishing drink, which they consumed with reed straws from tall jars. Yes, straws. These weren't your average plastic cocktail straws but hollow reeds, long and flexible, used to sip beer without disturbing the thick layer of sediment that settled at the bottom of their unfiltered brews. Imagine yourself in a Sumerian home, a mud brick dwelling with open courtyards and clay pots scattered about. You're dipping your reed into a shared vessel of beer, surrounded by friends and family. It's not just a drink. It's a ritual, a moment of connection in a world where life was often short and uncertain. As we move forward, keep this in mind. Beer wasn't an afterthought in Sumerian culture. It was central to their identity. It shaped their diet, economy, and even their religious practices. Without beer, Sumer might never have become the cradle of civilization. The story of Sumerian beer begins with water, or, more specifically, the lack of clean water. In ancient Mesopotamia, water was both a blessing and a curse. The rivers that nurtured their crops also brought floods, silt, and disease. Drinking straight from these rivers was a gamble. One gulp might refresh you, while the next could lay you low with a stomach-churning illness. This is where beer became a game-changer. It wasn't just a pleasant beverage. It was a lifeline. The brewing process involved boiling the grain mixture, which killed harmful bacteria, and the alcohol content acted as a natural preservative. To the Sumerians, this wasn't microbiology. It was magic, or perhaps the favor of their gods. Imagine living in a world where every sip of water came with a risk. You're working under the relentless sun, sweating through layers of linen, and all you want is something to drink. Beer wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. It quenched thirst, nourished the body, and provided a little buzz to soften the edges of a harsh day. Now, here's the twist. Sumerians didn't understand germs or pathogens, but they knew beer was safer than water. They saw it as a divine gift, a miraculous transformation of ordinary grains into something life-sustaining. This reverence for beer permeated their culture, from their hymns to their legal codes. Let's pause here and step into a bustling Sumerian marketplace. The air is alive with the sound of merchants haggling, the bray of donkeys, and the hum of conversation. Among the clay jars of grain and oil, you'll find large vats of beer being ladled into smaller containers for eager customers. Beer wasn't just a drink for special occasions, it was a daily staple. Interestingly, the quality of water also determined the flavor and character of the beer. Sumerian brewers likely experimented with different water sources, adjusting their methods to suit the mineral content and taste. The result was a variety of beers, ranging from light and mild to rich and malty. Beer was so integral to Sumerian life that it even found its way into their wages. Imagine being paid not in coins or grain, but in pints of frothy brew. Laborers who built the towering ziggurats were often compensated with beer rations, which were carefully measured and distributed. A standard worker might receive 2 to 3 liters per day, a generous amount by today's standards. It's worth noting that beer wasn't consumed in isolation. It was always part of a larger social context. Sumerians drank beer with meals, during religious ceremonies, and at gatherings. The communal aspect of beer drinking brought people together, fostering a sense of unity and shared purpose. Historians often debate whether the Sumerians invented beer intentionally or stumbled upon it by accident. Some suggest that early brews were the happy result of grains left soaking too long, while others argue that the process was deliberately refined over generations. What we do know is that beer predates written history, making it one of humanity's oldest cultural traditions. Picture a group of Sumerian brewers, likely women, as brewing was considered an extension of household duties, stirring large clay vats under the shade of a palm frond canopy. They are laughing, chatting, and occasionally tasting their work, ensuring the flavor is just right. This wasn't just labor, it was artistry, passed down through generations like a cherished family recipe. And what about the vessels used for brewing and storing beer? The Sumerians crafted large, rounded jars from clay, often decorated with simple designs. These jars weren't just functional, they were symbols of abundance and hospitality. To offer someone a drink of beer was to share the fruits of your labor and the bounty of the gods. Beer didn't just solve the problem of dirty water, it turned an everyday necessity into a cultural cornerstone. It was a reminder that even in a world full of challenges, humans have an uncanny ability to turn survival into celebration. The Sumerians, ever imaginative, wove beer into their mythology, attributing its creation to the divine. Enter Ninkasi, the goddess of beer and brewing. She wasn't just a minor deity tucked away in the pantheon. She was celebrated with reverence and joy, a symbol of abundance and life's small, intoxicating pleasures. Imagine a golden-hued sunrise spilling over the plains of Mesopotamia. In the temples dedicated to Ninkasi, priests and priestesses offered libations of beer, murmuring prayers for good harvests and plentiful grain. It's a scene both sacred and everyday, blending the celestial with the earthly. At the heart of this worship was a hymn to Ninkasi, a poem that's part prayer, part brewing guide, and entirely fascinating. This ancient text, inscribed on clay tablets, is considered the world's oldest beer recipe. It describes, in lyrical detail, the steps of brewing, soaking barley, preparing dough-like bread called bapir, fermenting the mixture, and finally straining the brew. Your basin is filled with beer, the sounds of joy echo, the hymn declares. It's a line that transports you directly into the life of a Sumerian brewer, who likely sang this hymn as they worked, honoring Ninkasi with each stir of the pot. Let's pause to imagine the brewing process. Picture a bustling courtyard filled with the clatter of clay jars and the soft hum of activity. Women, who are the primary brewers, work methodically. They soak barley in large vats, letting the grains sprout before drying them in the sun. This malting process, though rudimentary by today's standards, was a stroke of culinary genius, unlocking sugars that would later fuel fermentation. Next comes the bread. Not the fluffy loaves you'd find in a modern bakery, but dense, cake-like lumps of beurre made from barley and emmer wheat. These were baked to a point where they could be stored long-term and later rehydrated for brewing. This ingenious combination of bread and beer-making highlights how interconnected Sumerian food culture was. And then, the magic happens. The rehydrated beurre and malted barley are mixed with water in large clay pots. Yeast, floating invisibly in the warm Mesopotamian air, finds its way into the mixture, setting off fermentation. The brewers might not have understood the science, but they recognized the transformation. The mixture bubbled and foamed, a living thing in its own right, as if touched by the goddess herself. The beer they produced was far from the clear lagers and ales of today. It was thick and cloudy, more like a hearty, liquid porridge. Rich in nutrients and low in alcohol, it provided sustenance as much as refreshment. The taste? Likely earthy, sour, and slightly sweet, a flavor profile that would be considered exotic by modern palates. Here's where things get particularly charming. Sumerians didn't just brew beer, they celebrated it with style. Archaeological finds include intricate cylinder seals, miniature works of art carved into stone, depicting scenes of beer drinking. One seal shows two figures seated at a table, each sipping from a tall vessel through a reed straw. You can almost hear their laughter, see the camaraderie as they enjoyed this simple, shared pleasure. In Sumerian society, beer was more than a drink. It was a gift from Ninkasi, a divine blessing that brought people together. Religious ceremonies often included beer offerings, poured into special vessels as an act of devotion. Temples even operated their own breweries, producing beer for rituals and as sustenance for temple workers. The connection between Ninkasi and beer highlights the Sumerians' ability to find the divine in the everyday. Brewing wasn't just a chore. It was an act of creation, a way of honoring the goddess and ensuring the community's well-being. Through the rhythmic process of malting, fermenting, and pouring, they bridged the gap between human effort and divine grace. But Ninkasi's story isn't just about brewing. It's about resilience and ingenuity. In a world where life could be unpredictable and harsh, the act of making beer became a symbol of hope and resourcefulness. It was a reminder that, with the right ingredients and a little divine inspiration, even the most basic elements of life, water, grain, and yeast, could be transformed into something extraordinary. As the hymn fades, so too does the bustling courtyard, leaving you with a sense of quiet appreciation for the Sumerians' creativity and reverence. They didn't just invent beer, they imbued it with meaning, weaving it into the fabric of their culture in ways that resonate even today. Beer wasn't just a drink in ancient Sumer, it was the cornerstone of their economy. When you picture the bustling marketplaces of Mesopotamia, don't just imagine rows of clay jars filled with grain or oil. Picture rows of vessels filled with beer, their surfaces etched with markings denoting quality, ownership. Beer wasn't merely consumed, it was traded, bartered, and even used as a form of currency. Let's take a walk through a typical Sumerian market. The sun is high, casting golden light over rows of vendors calling out their wares. The scent of roasted barley mingles with the aroma of dried dates and fresh bread. At the heart of this lively scene stands a brewer's stall, where clay pots brimming with beer are arranged like treasures. Buyers line up, clay tablets in hand, ready to exchange goods or services for a taste of this nourishing brew. In ancient Sumer, beer was as valuable as it was versatile. Workers, particularly those tasked with building monumental structures like ziggurats, were often paid in beer. Imagine hauling massive bricks under the scorching sun, knowing that at the end of the day, your reward was a refreshing jar of barley beer. It wasn't just hydration, it was sustenance, packed with calories and nutrients. Even scribes, those educated elites who inscribed the history of Sumer into clay tablets, were compensated with beer. These records, preserved for millennia, often include meticulous accounts of beer rations. For example, a temple worker might receive a daily allotment of 2 jars, while a higher-ranking official might enjoy 3 or 4. But beer wasn't just an economic staple, it was a social equalizer. Rich or poor, labor or priest, everyone drank beer. It was served at feasts, religious ceremonies, and even legal proceedings. The communal act of sharing beer reinforced social bonds, creating a sense of unity among the diverse people of Sumer. Historians still debate how the Sumerians managed the logistics of such a beer-centric economy. Some believe they had dedicated breweries in each city-state, while others suggest smaller-scale operations run by families or temples. What's clear is that brewing was a thriving industry, employing countless people and supporting a complex web of trade. Here's a quirky tidbit. Beer was so central to Sumerian life that they developed specific words and symbols for it in their cuneiform script. One of the most famous symbols, a combination of barley and a jar, represented not just beer but abundance itself. Writing wasn't just a tool for recording transactions. It was a celebration of their culture, with beer at its heart. Now, let's zoom in on the brewers themselves. Many of them were women, known as sabatu. These female brewers held a respected place in society, managing both the technical and social aspects of beer production. In fact, brewing was often considered an extension of the domestic sphere, where women excelled at transforming raw ingredients into sustenance. The craft of brewing required skill, patience, and a deep understanding of the ingredients. Brewers experimented with different grains, fermentation times, and additives like honey or dates to create unique flavors. Some beers were light and bubbly, perfect for casual drinking, while others were rich and potent, reserved for special occasions. Imagine yourself as a brewer in ancient Sumer. You wake before dawn, the air cool and quiet. In the dim light of an oil lamp, you inspect the barley, ensuring it sprouted just enough for malting. By midday, the courtyard is alive with the aroma of boiling grain and the chatter of neighbors stopping by to check on the progress. Each step of the process, from mashing to fermenting, is a blend of tradition and intuition. But brewing wasn't just about technique, it was about community. Brewers often shared their knowledge, passing down recipes and methods through generations. They understood that beer wasn't just a product. It was a symbol of connection, a way to bring people together. And bring people together it did. Picture a festival in honor of Ninkasi, where the air buzzes with excitement. Long tables are set with clay vessels, each filled to the brim with freshly brewed beer. Music plays, children run through the crowd, and adults toast to health, prosperity, and the divine gift of brewing. Beer wasn't just an economic commodity. It was a cultural cornerstone, a reminder that even in the most ancient of times, humans understood the value of a shared drink and a shared moment. When it came to brewing beer, the Sumerians had their rituals down to a science, although they wouldn't have called it that. Their methods combined practical knowledge, religious reverence, and a touch of experimentation. Brewing was more than just a process. It was a craft honed over generations, rooted in the rhythms of the natural world. Picture yourself in a Sumerian courtyard, shaded by date palms. It's early morning, and the brewing process begins. Large clay pots are scattered across the space, some filled with sprouting barley, others with water or fermenting mixtures. Women are hard at work, their hands deftly measuring, stirring, and tasting. This is a scene of quiet industry, where every step matters. First, the barley is soaked and left to sprout. This malting process unlocks the starches in the grain, transforming them into fermentable sugars. The sprouted barley is then dried, often under the warm Mesopotamian sun, and ground into coarse flour. This flour forms the base of bapir, the dense barley bread essential to Sumerian brewing. Now comes the fascinating part. The bapir is baked, not to be eaten, but to be stored and later rehydrated. This step allowed brewers to preserve their ingredients, ensuring a steady supply of beer even during lean times. It's a clever workaround, showcasing the ingenuity of Sumerian brewers. Once the bapir is ready, it's mixed with water and malted barley in large clay vats. The resulting mash is thick and aromatic, a blend of earthy grains and sweet undertones. The brewers stir the mixture with wooden paddles, their movements rhythmic and deliberate. It's not just labor. It's a ritual, an act of creation that connects them to their ancestors and their gods. Fermentation is where the magic truly happens. Yeast, invisible to the naked eye, begins its work, converting sugars into alcohol. The mixture bubbles and foams, releasing a tangy, yeasty aroma. To the Sumerians, this was the work of Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. Her divine touch transformed ordinary ingredients into something extraordinary. Here's where we encounter one of history's quirks. Sumerian beer wasn't filtered like modern brews. It was thick and cloudy, often requiring a straw to drink. These straws, made from reeds or even precious metals for the wealthy, were essential tools. They allowed drinkers to enjoy their beer without swallowing bits of grain or sediment. Now imagine a Sumerian feast. Guests recline on woven mats, their clay cups filled with frothy beer. They sip through their straws, laughing and talking as the sun sets over the plains. The atmosphere is lively but relaxed, a celebration of life's simple pleasures. Beer wasn't just about nourishment or intoxication, it was a sensory experience. The Sumerians likely flavored their brews with ingredients like honey, dates, or spices, creating a range of tastes and aromas. Each sip was a journey, a reminder of the brewer's skill and the bounty of the land. Interestingly, brewing also served a practical purpose. By turning surplus grain into beer, the Sumerians could preserve their harvest and prevent waste. It was an early form of food storage, ensuring the community had sustenance even during hard times. Historians still debate the exact methods Sumerians used to control fermentation and flavor. Some believe they relied on natural yeast from the air, while others suggest they cultivated specific strains over time. What's clear is that their brewing techniques were sophisticated, a testament to their deep understanding of their environment. Brewing wasn't just a task, it was a way of life. It connected the Sumerians to their land, their community, and their gods. Each batch of beer was a blend of tradition, innovation, and reverence, a symbol of humanity's ability to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. And as the final step in the brewing process unfolds, straining the beer into smaller vessels for storage, you can almost hear the brewers sigh with satisfaction. Their work is done, the fruits of their labor ready to be shared and enjoyed. As much as beer was a practical beverage, it was equally central to Sumerian culture and religion. The act of brewing wasn't just about providing nourishment or quenching thirst. It was an offering, a way of invoking divine favor. You see, beer was seen as a gift from the gods, and its consumption was a ritual act, one that both honored the divine and reinforced social bonds. At the center of this was Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, who was revered not only as the patron of brewing, but also as a symbol of fertility and abundance. The Sumerians believed that by consuming beer, they were participating in a sacred tradition that connected them to the divine order of the universe. Let's imagine the scene during a Sumerian festival, perhaps one held in Ninkasi's honor. The city is bustling with excitement, the streets filled with the rich scent of freshly baked bread and roasting meats. In the central courtyard of the temple, large stone vats filled with beer await the celebrants. The air is filled with music, and the rhythmic chanting of priests and priestesses can be heard, their voices rising in unison to honor the goddess. Hey, the beer is not merely a drink, it is an offering. The priestess, dressed in fine robes, raises a ceremonial jar of beer and pours it onto the ground, the liquid spilling in offering to Ninkasi. This is a gesture of gratitude and respect, a reminder that beer was not just a commodity, but a sacred part of life. Sumerians didn't just drink beer at festivals, though. It was consumed regularly as part of daily life. Archaeological records suggest that beer was served during important social gatherings, such as weddings, feasts, and legal proceedings. These occasions weren't just about food and drink, they were about affirming one's place in the community and in the divine order. Beer, in its thick, cloudy form, helped create a sense of shared experience and communal connection. For the wealthy, beer was often accompanied by elaborate feasts. As guests reclined on cushions, they would sip their beer and partake in lavish spreads of fruits, meats, and breads. The atmosphere was one of indulgence, but also of ritual. At the table, the act of drinking beer was often accompanied by conversation, storytelling, and the sharing of wisdom. It wasn't just about satisfying physical thirst, it was about nurturing the spirit and maintaining the bonds of society. One interesting tidbit is that, in some cases, beer consumption had a legal aspect. During certain legal proceedings, parties involved in disputes might be required to drink beer to symbolize their commitment to honesty and truth. The idea was that beer had a calming effect, enabling individuals to settle disputes peacefully. In fact, the famous Code of Yornamu, one of the oldest known legal codes, includes provisions for beer in legal contexts. Now, imagine that for a moment. In a courtroom, a judge orders both parties to drink beer before continuing the trial. The idea wasn't so much about intoxication as it was about creating a more relaxed atmosphere, one where the tension of the courtroom could be eased and negotiations could take place on more equal footing. Interestingly, beer also had a role in temple economics. Temples in Sumer were not just religious centers, they were economic hubs. Many temples operated large-scale brewing facilities, producing beer not only for worship, but also for trade. Beer became a valuable commodity, and temple breweries played a key role in the economy of ancient Mesopotamia. These institutions were some of the earliest examples of organized industrial production, with brewers working under the auspices of the temple to produce beer in large quantities. The beer produced in these temple breweries wasn't just for the elite or for ceremonial purposes. It was distributed to the workers who built the great ziggurats and temples, to the priests and priestesses who maintained the sacred rites, and to the people who lived in the city. It was an essential part of daily life, a form of currency, and a way to ensure that the God's blessings were shared with all people, not just the wealthy or the powerful. As we think about the beer culture in ancient Sumer, it's clear that it wasn't just about the drink itself, it was about everything that beer represented. It was about community, about spirituality, about tradition, and about connecting with the divine. Beer was both a gift and a tool, a symbol of human ingenuity and divine favor. It was a bridge between the earthly and the divine, a way for the Sumerians to partake in the eternal rhythm of life, just as the grain grew from the earth and was transformed by the hand of the brewer into something sacred. Let's now move beyond the spiritual and ceremonial to the practical side of beer in ancient Sumerian society. While the festivals and rituals surrounding beer certainly played a key role, beer was, at its core, an everyday part of life, so much so that it permeated almost every aspect of Sumerian culture. Imagine waking up to a day where the sun is still cool, and the first task before breakfast is grabbing a jar of beer from the clay pot in your home. For the Sumerians, beer wasn't a luxury reserved for special occasions. It was a staple. Workers on construction sites, including those building monumental ziggurats, were often paid with beer. In fact, beer was such an integral part of their daily lives that some believe it was more of a laborious ration than a treat. Think of it like how modern workers might be given lunch or water during a shift, but instead, beer was the fuel for the Sumerian workforce. Let's slow down and take a walk through a day in the life of a Sumerian laborer. You're on the construction crew tasked with the ambitious goal of building a ziggurat. The work is grueling and tiring, and the scorching Mesopotamian sun makes every movement feel like an effort. But at least there's a little relief, a break for a sip of beer, which was handed out to workers to refresh them and keep them hydrated. After all, beer wasn't just about calories, it was packed with nutrients that helped sustain these workers. Beer wasn't just a simple beverage, it was a nourishment in liquid form. It contained a decent amount of protein, vitamins, and carbohydrates, which were important for a population that lived in a region with limited natural resources. While the rich enjoyed their elaborate feasts, beer was often the primary sustenance for the common people. Sumerians believed that the gods had gifted them with beer to provide strength and vitality. It wasn't unusual to see a worker take a deep drink from a jar, wipe the foam from their lips, and return to their labor with renewed energy. It's not hard to imagine how beer might have helped boost morale in such a physically demanding environment. Historians still debate whether this daily beer consumption was regulated by the temples or if it was more of an informal custom. What's clear, though, is that there was a deep connection between beer and the Sumerian labor force. Some believe that the temple breweries might have been closely linked to the workforces building temples and ziggurats, with beer production serving both a ceremonial and practical function. Here's another fascinating detail. Beer in Sumer was often consumed in large communal gatherings. People would gather in open-air courtyards, and beer would be passed around from person to person, sipped from the same clay cup or straw. The act of sharing beer wasn't just about the drink itself. It was a communal bonding experience. You shared your beer, your stories, and your time. In a way, beer was a symbol of social equality. No matter your rank, whether you were a humble laborer or a wealthy merchant, beer was something that could be shared. The drinking of beer helped level social barriers, bringing people together and reinforcing their bonds within the community. That's not to say there weren't distinctions in the types of beer consumed. For the elite, beer was often brewed with higher quality ingredients and might even be spiced with honey or dates for added sweetness. But the basic form of beer thick and nutritious, was something that everyone could enjoy. One curious aspect of beer consumption in ancient Sumer is that it wasn't only about drinking to get drunk. In fact, the Sumerians didn't see beer in the same way we often do today. The goal wasn't necessarily to drink large quantities for the sake of inebriation. It was more about the experience of drinking itself, the act of sharing and participating in the community. Beer was a part of life, not a means of escape. Even the laws around beer were unique. Some of the earliest written laws, such as the famous Code of Yornamu, included provisions about beer, showing how integral it was to society. These laws outlined not just how beer was produced and distributed, but also how it could be traded, sold, and consumed. Some codes even dictated the punishments for drinking too much beer. Although this wasn't necessarily a sign of moral judgment, it was more about maintaining order and balance. In ancient Sumer, beer consumption was tied to a sense of community, hard work, and divine favor. It wasn't just a drink. It was a part of the fabric of daily life, from the lowest worker to the highest priest. And despite the passage of thousands of years, the memory of this humble, nourishing beverage still lingers in the echoes of ancient clay jars and the echoes of bustling Sumerian marketplaces. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on something a bit surprising: the remarkable influence beer had on early forms of Sumerian writing. That's right, beer might have played a role in the creation of written language itself. This connection between beer and writing might not be immediately obvious, but stick with me for a moment. It's a fascinating tidbit. In ancient Sumer, the need to record transactions involving beer was a practical driving force behind the invention of cuneiform, one of the earliest forms of writing. Picture this: beer was exchanged in large quantities, as it was a daily commodity and part of the economy. Merchants, brewers, and temple workers needed a way to keep track of how much beer was brewed, traded, or consumed. So, they devised a simple system of marks on clay tablets to record these transactions. In the beginning, these early forms of writing weren't used for storytelling or grand literary works. They were practical and functional. They were tools, much like the tablets used to track barley or cattle. To make these records, scribes would press a reed stylus into soft clay, forming wedge-shaped impressions, which eventually became the cuneiform script. In fact, some of the earliest known cuneiform tablets we found in archaeological digs are lists of beer rations, detailing how much beer was assigned to workers, priests, and even the king himself. Imagine the scribe in the dim light of a clay hut, carefully carving each wedge-shaped mark into the tablet. His job was to track the amount of beer that had been brewed in the temple, how much had been distributed to the laborious working on the ziggurat, and how much was left over for the gods. While these early scribes might not have had visions of great literature in mind, they were performing an essential function in the smooth operation of their society. Without these records, the complex system of beer distribution in Sumer could have easily fallen into chaos. Historians still debate whether beer was the singular inspiration for cuneiform writing, but it's clear that the administrative need for record-keeping was crucial. As the ancient scribes learned to write, they went on to use this new skill for much more than just accounting for beer. Over time, cuneiform would evolve to record myths, stories, laws, and poetry, but its roots were, at least in part, grounded in the need to keep track of this essential, life-sustaining drink. Even the word for beer in Sumerian, kaz, has been found in many of the earliest cuneiform tablets, alongside other terms for food and goods. These early scribes made no secret of the importance of beer. In fact, as you trace the development of writing, you can follow the trail of beer in Sumer society, from the beer-fueled labor force to the administrative systems that helped build their civilization. But what's more intriguing is that beer wasn't the only thing scribes tracked. They were also responsible for documenting all sorts of aspects of life in Sumer, from trade and commerce to agricultural practices. Beer, in essence, was a part of a much larger system of social organization. It was the fuel for the workforce, the currency of the everyday person, and the gift of the gods, all elements that needed to be kept track of. Without this basic record-keeping, Sumerian society might not have been able to grow and prosper the way it did. At this point, we might be wondering how much beer these ancient Sumerians actually drank. It's hard to say for certain, but some estimates suggest that a single worker could consume up to 5 liters of beer a day. Remember, this wasn't the pale, watered-down version of beer we might be familiar with today. This was a thick, porridge-like liquid, rich in nutrients. In fact, this consistency was one of the reasons beer was so filling. It wasn't just a drink, it was a meal in a cup. Still, historians debate whether the amount of beer consumed had any kind of social significance. Was 5 liters a necessity for maintaining energy and health, or was it a reflection of cultural values that placed a great emphasis on beer as a central part of life? Perhaps it was both necessary and symbolic. After all, in a society where beer was so deeply tied to religion, work, and social order, it's not hard to imagine that the drink could have taken on a significance far beyond simple nutrition. Whatever the case, the important takeaway here is that beer wasn't just a drink in ancient Sumer. It was a key driver of culture, economics, and even the development of writing. From the first records of beer transactions on clay tablets to the rituals of beer drinking in religious ceremonies, beer was more than just a beverage. It was a cornerstone of Sumerian life, linking people to each other and to the divine. Now, as we sip our modern drinks, which may or may not be beer, it's worth remembering how far back this tradition stretches. Thousands of years ago, in the heart of Mesopotamia, beer was more than just a way to cool off after a day's work. It was the lifeblood of a civilization. Let's take a little detour now, diving deeper into the role of beer in religious life. By this point, you've probably gathered that beer was everywhere in Sumerian society, but its influence didn't stop at the marketplace or the labor site. Beer was woven into the very fabric of religious practice. In fact, the Sumerians believed that beer was a divine gift from the gods themselves, with its very origins tied to the heavens. The goddess Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer, holds a special place in the history of both beer and spirituality. She wasn't just a figurehead. She represented the abundance and fertility of the land, the fruits of the earth, and the life-giving properties of beer. In ancient Sumer, it was believed that the gods enjoyed beer just as much as the people did, perhaps even more so. The most famous of the beer-related religious texts comes from the hymn to Ninkasi, a 1,800-year-old piece of poetry dedicated to this very goddess. This hymn is particularly special because it is the earliest known recipe for brewing beer that we have. While most of us today rely on commercial brewers to craft our beer, ancient Sumerians had their own methods that included barley, water, and, interestingly, dates. The hymn to Ninkasi was more than just a religious offering. It was a practical guide for brewing beer. The lyrics, written in praise of the goddess, detailed the brewing process, step by step. The song began by outlining the preparation of barley, which would be soaked, mashed, and fermented, before explaining how to turn this simple grain into the nourishing drink we recognize as beer. As you can imagine, having a sacred text that also doubled as a brewing guide was quite the innovation. It showed just how intertwined religion and everyday life were for the Sumerians. Historians still argue over whether the hymn was used strictly for religious purposes, as a part of a ritual, or whether it was an actual practical brewing guide for the community. But one thing is certain, Ninkasi's name, like the word for beer itself, was central to Sumerian culture. The hymns and prayers sung in her honor wouldn't have been complete without her most sacred gift, the beer. These religious connections didn't stop with Ninkasi. The rituals involving beer were deeply ingrained in Sumerian temple practices. In the grand ziggurats, where priestesses and priests presided over ceremonies, beer was offered as part of sacrificial rites. The gods were thought to appreciate offerings of beer, and it was believed that by drinking it, the gods would grant prosperity and fertility to the land. Imagine a high priestess standing before a crowd of worshippers, raising a goblet of beer to the heavens in an offering that symbolized the hope for a bountiful harvest. Beer was often considered a tool for communication with the divine. Just as wine was used in many cultures to sanctify a moment, beer was an intermediary between the earthly and the divine. The Sumerians believed that by consuming this drink, they could bring themselves closer to the gods. And in temples across Sumer, beer was poured freely for the faithful, not just for the workers, but also for the divine. The ties between beer and religion were not unique to Sumer. Ancient cultures around the world, from Egypt to Greece, had similar traditions. But it was in Sumer that beer truly found its place as both a social beverage and a sacrament, intimately tied to spiritual life. Now, let's consider a more playful side of these religious ceremonies. Imagine attending one of these festivals, where beer was being served in large quantities. There would be chanting, music, dancing, and merrymaking, all accompanied by the steady stream of beer being passed around. It wasn't uncommon for these festivals to last for days, as people celebrated in the hopes of pleasing the gods. And all the while, beer flowed freely, fueling both the festivities and the deep spiritual devotion that lay at the heart of these ceremonies. Beer didn't just keep the people hydrated during these celebrations, it helped them connect to something bigger than themselves. These ceremonies were meant to unite the community, to bring everyone together in the shared belief that the gods were present in their midst. So, while today we might think of beer as a casual drink to share with friends, for the Sumerians, it was sacred. It was a symbol of divine favor, a bridge between the earthly realm and the heavens. Interestingly, this divine aspect of beer didn't just disappear after the fall of Sumer. Later civilizations, including the Babylonians and even the Greeks, continued to associate beer with the gods, even though their brewing methods and ingredients evolved over time. In a way, beer's connection to the divine has been present in many cultures for thousands of years, creating a lasting legacy that ties humanity's most beloved beverage to spirituality and ritual. While modern-day beer might not be considered sacred in the same way, it's clear that its origins lie in these ancient, deeply spiritual practices. The next time you sit down for a beer, perhaps you'll remember that, thousands of years ago, it wasn't just a drink. It was a way to honor the gods, to celebrate community, and to share in the blessings of life. Let's shift gears slightly and take a look at the brewing methods the Sumerians used, and how they might have compared to the beer we know today. You might be surprised to learn that ancient Sumerian beer didn't come in bottles or cans. It wasn't even a clear liquid like what we often drink now. Instead, Sumerian beer was thick, somewhat opaque, and had a porridge-like consistency. Imagine a warm, grainy soup, rather than the cold, bubbly drink we're accustomed to. This, believe it or not, was considered the height of luxury for the Sumerians. To understand how this beer was made, we have to think about the technology they had at the time. Brewing beer in Sumer wasn't a simple process. It involved several key steps. First, barley would be soaked in water, allowing it to sprout and begin the germination process. This process would help break down the starches in the barley into fermentable sugars. After the barley had sprouted, it was then roasted to stop the germination. At this point, the grains would have a distinct, malty flavor. Once roasted, the barley would be mashed and then combined with water in a large vat. But the real trick was in the fermentation process. Instead of the clean yeast fermentation we know today, the Sumerians used a process called wild fermentation. In this method, the natural yeast present in the environment would inoculate the barley mixture, causing it to ferment and turn into alcohol. The result was a beverage that was potent, but also cloudy and thick, more like a meal in a bowl than a drink you'd sip at a bar. Historians still debate whether this ancient beer was intoxicating by modern standards. The alcohol content was likely lower than many of the beers we enjoy today, but that doesn't mean it wasn't powerful. The thick texture and relatively low alcohol content would have made it quite filling, turning each sip into more of a meal. In fact, the Sumerians didn't drink beer for pleasure the way we do today. It was an essential part of their diet, and it provided both nutrition and hydration. Beer in Sumer wasn't just for the elites either. While it's true that the kings and priests likely had access to the best batches, beer was widely consumed by all levels of society. Workers in the fields, craftsmen, and even the laborers building the grand ziggurats were often given beer as part of their daily rations. It was a symbol of both social status and sustenance. And, considering how hard the Sumerians worked to harvest and brew it, beer became deeply woven into the fabric of their economy. As we move further back in time, it's worth noting that the Sumerians weren't the only ones brewing beer with such ancient methods. In fact, almost every early civilization had their own variation of this porridge-like brew. The Egyptians, for example, brewed their own version of thick beer, which they also considered a vital part of their diet. In ancient China, the first recorded beer-like beverages were made from millet and barley. But what set the Sumerians apart was their sophisticated brewing methods, which they improved over centuries to create one of the most enduring elements of their culture, beer. Even though Sumerian beer might seem strange to us today, it was the foundation upon which modern brewing was built. The grains, the fermentation methods, and even the ceremonial aspects all played a significant role in the development of beer as we know it now. Without the Sumerians, we might not have had the beer industry we enjoy today. At least not in the same way. Now, imagine yourself in a bustling Sumerian marketplace. You walk past the bread stalls and the potters, the air filled with the scent of roasting barley and the sound of vendors calling out their wares. At the edge of the market, a large stone vat stands, bubbling with beer. You can see workers and traders gathered around, dipping cups into the vat, sipping from the thick, creamy brew. It's not the refreshing pint you'd order at a bar today, but in this world, it's a drink of sustenance, community, and ceremony. Even if we look back on these practices with modern eyes, it's hard not to feel a sense of respect for the ingenuity of the Sumerians. They knew how to make beer not just a commodity, but a cornerstone of their society, something that could sustain you through a long day of labor, connect you with your fellow workers, and even draw you closer to the divine. There's a certain beauty in that, even if it's not the way we typically think of beer today. The Sumerians were far from alone in their beer-making prowess. Their method spread through trade and conquest, influencing neighboring civilizations like the Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians. These cultures adopted similar techniques, further refining the process and ensuring that beer remained an integral part of human life for millennia. In many ways, beer is the most enduring legacy of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, an ever-present companion in the rituals and routines of life, from the worker's cup to the king's chalice. Let's take a breather from the brewing process itself and explore the social and economic role that beer played in Sumerian society. In ancient civilizations, food and drink were far more than simple pleasures. They were symbols of status, power, and identity. Beer in Sumer was no different. It wasn't just about quenching your thirst. It was about what beer represented in the broader context of daily life, economics, and even social hierarchies. Beer wasn't a luxury enjoyed exclusively by the ruling class. In fact, it was a staple for nearly every level of society. The workers building the mighty ziggurats, the towering temples dedicated to the gods, received their daily ration of beer, often as part of their wages. This wasn't just an act of generosity from the rulers. It was a calculated move. The Sumerian economy was tightly controlled, and beer was an essential part of the labor force's motivation. It was both sustenance and incentive, much like how modern workers might receive a lunch break or a cup of coffee to keep them going. What's truly fascinating is how the consumption of beer was regulated and standardized. The Sumerians had a form of beer taxation that helped maintain social order. The brewing process itself wasn't left to chance. There were dedicated brewers who specialized in crafting this sacred beverage. And the fact that beer was so widely consumed across all social classes means that its regulation was closely tied to the economic structure. The temple priests and kings controlled access to this valuable commodity, ensuring that everyone from the lowliest laborer to the wealthiest noble had their share, albeit in different amounts and qualities. In fact, some records suggest that beer was even used as currency in Sumer. It was often exchanged for goods or services, a practice that likely began in the temples before spreading into the broader marketplace. Imagine being paid not in coins or notes but in jugs of beer. It's not such a crazy idea when you think about it. After all, beer was essential for survival. It was nutritious, hydrating, and, in many ways, more reliable than water. In an age where fresh water wasn't always safe to drink, beer offered a cleaner, safer alternative. Beer also served as a form of social currency. It was shared at feasts and festivals, where it was often poured as a ceremonial drink for the gods. The Sumerians were not alone in using alcohol in ritualistic settings. Many ancient societies had similar practices. However, what set the Sumerians apart was the institutionalized role of beer in their religious and daily lives. Their entire worldview seemed to center around balance, and beer played a key role in maintaining that balance. The drink was not just a tool for socialization, but also a symbol of divine favor. The most powerful figures in Sumerian society, such as the kings and high priests, had access to the finest quality beer, clear, smooth, and carefully brewed. Meanwhile, common laborers likely drank a more rustic version, with a thick, grainy texture. It's easy to see how beer could become a symbol of status, just like wine or fine food in other cultures. But despite these differences in quality, beer was still deeply ingrained in the culture of every Sumerian. It represented more than just a drink. It was a shared experience that unified the people, no matter their class. In ancient Sumer, social life was deeply intertwined with the consumption of beer. This drink wasn't just a way to get through the workday or a recreational activity. It was a focal point of the community. Beer was drunk in temples, in the homes of nobles, and in the fields by laborers. It was present in festivals, celebrations, and rituals. It symbolized the relationship between humanity and the gods, a connection that could be nurtured by something as simple as a sip of beer. Historians still debate how much of this beer consumption was truly a joyous occasion, and how much of it was rooted in necessity. Was it the start of a great festival, or was it simply a way to keep the workers from dehydration and exhaustion? Some argue that beer's role in these festivals was central to the creation of community bonds, while others suggest that it was more of a necessity, an essential resource that everyone could rely on in times of hardship. But one thing is clear, whether in times of joy or labor, beer was the drink that tied the Sumerians together. It's also interesting to consider how these practices influenced the cultures that followed. The Babylonians, for instance, were known to have adopted many of Sumer's customs, including the brewing of beer. The same can be said for the Persians and the Egyptians, who took the knowledge of brewing and transformed it in their own ways. In fact, beer became such a staple of ancient life that it would spread far beyond the borders of Sumer to become a defining aspect of human civilization for millennia to come. Imagine now, if you will, a scene from a Sumerian festival. Long tables heaving with bread and fruits, the air thick with the scent of roasting barley, and the steady sound of clinking cups as beer is passed around. The music swells, the dancers move in a slow, rhythmic procession, and the entire scene is bathed in the amber glow of oil lamps. For the Sumerians, these moments were more than just celebrations. They were a way to connect with their past, their gods, and each other. The beer flowed freely, a gift from the heavens to the earth. Now, let's shift our focus to the religious and spiritual significance of beer in Sumerian society. The Sumerians were deeply religious people, and their gods were intimately involved in their daily lives, even in their consumption of food and drink. Beer was no mere refreshment. It was considered a gift from the gods, a sacred beverage that could connect humans to the divine. One of the most prominent gods associated with beer was Ninkasi, the goddess of beer and brewing. She was the patron deity of the brewing process, and in Sumerian mythology, she was often invoked in rituals surrounding the production and consumption of beer. In fact, the Sumerians believed that Ninkasi not only presided over the brewing process, but also blessed the beer, ensuring that it was both nutritious and intoxicating. She was the embodiment of the life-giving qualities of beer, and her influence permeated every part of Sumerian society. Ninkasi's association with beer is so strong that we have a hymn to her that dates back to around 1800 BCE. Known as the Hymn to Ninkasi, this ancient text is one of the earliest written records of the brewing process. The hymn is essentially a recipe for brewing beer, with verses that detail the ingredients, techniques, and rituals involved in making the drink. The hymn itself is both a religious text and a practical guide, a testament to how beer and spirituality were intertwined for the Sumerians. Historians still debate whether the hymn was a literal brewing recipe, or more of a symbolic or ceremonial guide to the act of brewing. Some scholars argue that it was meant to be a purely religious text, reflecting the deep reverence Sumerians held for Ninkasi and the sacred act of beer production. Others suggest that it was a practical tool for brewers, passed down through generations to ensure that beer was made in accordance with religious rites. Regardless of its exact purpose, the hymn shows how the brewing of beer was not simply a mundane task but a sacred duty, entrusted to those who could carry out the process in a way that honored the gods. In addition to Ninkasi, there were other deities associated with beer and its consumption. The god of wisdom, Enki, was often depicted as a patron of craftsmen, including brewers. It was believed that Enki gave the Sumerians the knowledge of how to brew beer, and that he taught them the skills necessary to transform barley into the sacred drink. His role in beer making was significant, as he was also associated with water and fertility, both of which were essential components in the brewing process. Enki's blessings were seen as integral to producing beer that was not only potent, but also of the highest quality. Beer wasn't just a tool for everyday socializing. It was a central element of Sumerian religious festivals and rituals. The Sumerians believed that sharing beer was a way to honor the gods and maintain a connection with them. During religious ceremonies, beer would often be offered as a sacrifice to the gods. It was believed that by offering beer, the Sumerians were ensuring divine favor, prosperity, and protection. In many ways, beer was seen as a medium through which the gods could communicate with the people. The connection between beer and the divine was also reflected in Sumerian funeral practices. In some cases, beer was included as part of burial offerings for the deceased. The belief was that the beer would sustain the soul of the deceased in the afterlife, ensuring that they were nourished and protected in their journey. This shows just how central beer was to the Sumerian worldview. It wasn't just a drink. It was a spiritual artifact, a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. Beyond the festivals and rituals, beer also played a role in the legal and political systems of ancient Sumer. The famous Code of Yornamu, one of the earliest known law codes, includes references to beer. In these laws, the consumption of beer was regulated, and there were penalties for the improper brewing or selling of beer. The Sumerians took their beer very seriously, to the point where it was woven into the fabric of their legal system. This is further evidence of just how important beer was to their culture. Beer also had its place in Sumerian royal courts, where it was consumed during feasts and ceremonies. The Sumerian kings were not only political leaders, but also religious figures, and their consumption of beer was seen as a way to honor the gods and maintain divine favor. These royal feasts were elaborate affairs, with beer flowing freely and accompanied by lavish banquets. The kings and their guests would recline on cushions, drink beer from intricately designed vessels, and enjoy music, dancing, and storytelling. It was a celebration of the gods, the king's power, and the prosperity of the kingdom. In these royal settings, beer wasn't just for the common folk. It was a symbol of the king's wealth, influence, and connection to the divine. To partake in beer with the king was a sign of status, a recognition of one's place in the social hierarchy. And it wasn't just about drinking beer. It was about drinking it in the right way, at the right time, and in the right company. Beer in ancient Sumer was a social currency, just as much as it was a religious one. So, when you think about ancient beer, don't just imagine it as a simple drink. It was a cornerstone of Sumerian society, an essential part of their religious rituals, their social interactions, and even their political life. Beer wasn't just a beverage. It was a symbol of the divine, a means of connecting with the gods, and a medium through which Sumerians could maintain balance in their lives. Now, picture yourself once more in that bustling Sumerian marketplace, where beer is being brewed in large vats and passed from hand to hand. As the aroma of roasting barley fills the air, you can sense the importance of this drink. It's more than just liquid in a cup. It's the lifeblood of this ancient society, linking every person to the gods, to each other, and to the land they worked so hard to sustain. The journey of beer through Sumer doesn't end with its role in rituals and social life. Let's delve into how the legacy of Sumerian beer traveled far beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, spreading to other civilizations, influencing their cultures, and leaving an indelible mark on history. Beer, as a fundamental human discovery, became a universal element that transcended borders and time periods. But the Sumerians were the first to elevate it to such a prominent place in society, a fact that would echo for centuries. As Sumerian civilization began to decline and was absorbed into the Akkadian Empire, the culture of beer-making didn't fade away. Instead, it took root in neighboring regions, influencing the brewing practices of other ancient civilizations. The Babylonians, who succeeded the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, inherited many of their cultural and religious customs, including their reverence for beer. In Babylon, beer remained a staple of daily life, and the influence of Sumerian brewing techniques persisted. The Babylonians, like the Sumerians, included beer in their religious rituals, offering it as a gift to their gods and consuming it during festivals. However, they also made their own innovations. Babylonian beer, for instance, was often flavored with a variety of herbs and spices, adding a new layer of complexity to the ancient brew. Historians note that this practice might have been influenced by the region's other culinary traditions, as Babylon was a melting pot of different cultures, each contributing their unique flavors and spices to the food and drink scene. As the influence of Babylonian culture spread, so did the practice of brewing beer. The Assyrians, who followed the Babylonians, also continued the Sumerian tradition of beer consumption. Beer was so ingrained in Assyrian society that it appeared in the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal's royal banquets, where it was served alongside lavish feasts. Like the Sumerians, the Assyrians used beer as a medium of exchange and as an offering to their gods. It's clear that beer was far more than just a drink. It was a fundamental part of the ancient Mesopotamian worldview, integral to their social, economic, and spiritual practices. But the Sumerians were not the only civilization to have a profound impact on the history of beer. The ancient Egyptians also developed their own version of beer, borrowing many ideas from their Mesopotamian neighbors. The Egyptians were known to have brewed a beer made from barley, just like the Sumerians, but with a few distinctive differences. Egyptian beer was often thicker and more porridge-like, with a texture that resembled a stew. It was consumed daily by both the rich and the poor, with a particular emphasis on its health benefits. Egyptian beer was often regarded as a nutritious and restorative beverage, especially for workers and laborers who required the energy to build monumental structures like the pyramids. Beer was also significant in the daily lives of the ancient Egyptians because it was a key part of their social rituals. Much like in Sumer, beer played a prominent role in Egyptian religious ceremonies and offerings. It was often placed on altars and temples as a gift to the gods, reinforcing the idea that beer was a divine beverage. The Egyptians also had a goddess associated with beer, Tenenet, the goddess of beer and childbirth. She was revered for her nurturing qualities, as she was believed to protect women during childbirth and ensure the health of the community. From Egypt, the knowledge of brewing beer spread to other parts of Africa and the Mediterranean, where it was adapted and incorporated into local customs. In Greece and Rome, for example, beer was less popular than wine, but it was still consumed by certain segments of society. The ancient Greeks had a somewhat ambivalent relationship with beer. They called it brutos and considered it a drink for foreigners, as they preferred their wine. However, beer had its place in Greek culture, especially among the lower classes and soldiers. In fact, Greek soldiers were known to drink beer during their campaigns, as it was a more practical and less perishable beverage than wine. Meanwhile, the Romans, who were famous for their love of wine, also adopted beer from the Germanic tribes they encountered during their conquests. While beer was not as esteemed as wine, it became popular in the northern provinces of the Roman Empire. The Germanic tribes had a long history of brewing beer, and their techniques and recipes were passed on to the Romans. Beer became an integral part of Roman military life, and it was consumed during their long marches and campaigns. Even in far-flung regions like China and India, the practice of brewing beer had its own distinct evolution. In China, for example, beer-like beverages made from rice and barley were brewed as far back as the Shang dynasty, 16th to 11th centuries BCE. While these drinks weren't quite the same as Sumerian beer, they shared the same fundamental idea. Fermented grains create a nutritious, hydrating drink with a slight intoxicating effect. Indian civilizations also developed their own fermented beverages, often from rice, barley, or millet, with flavors and techniques that reflected the local environment and resources. The influence of Sumerian beer was thus felt across continents and centuries, as different cultures adapted and refined the art of brewing. The Sumerians may have been the first to truly understand the magic of fermentation, but the practice spread far and wide, touching nearly every ancient civilization in its wake. It's fascinating to think that the beer we drink today is part of a legacy that stretches back thousands of years, to those first brewers in ancient Sumer who, by sheer accident or ingenuity, discovered the transformative power of barley and water. And so, we find ourselves here, in the modern world, sipping beers that have evolved from those ancient concoctions. The simple pleasure of a cold drink, the clink of glasses among friends, is a direct line to the past, a living connection to the Sumerians and their rituals. What started as a humble experiment in fermentation has become a global tradition, enjoyed in countless forms across the world. The Sumerians didn't just invent beer, they set in motion an ancient, global tradition that continues to this very day. Now that we've journeyed through the history of Sumerian beer and its spread across civilizations, it's time to take a step back and reflect on just how transformative this ancient invention was for the world. In many ways, beer served as a bridge between ancient cultures, connecting people from different lands and backgrounds through a shared appreciation for fermented grains. From the Sumerians to the Egyptians, the Greeks, Romans, and beyond, beer was more than just a drink. It was a symbol of community, culture, and continuity. But there's an aspect of Sumerian beer that is often overlooked, the role it played in shaping our understanding of health and nutrition. Beer wasn't just a drink for pleasure or ritual. It was also a source of sustenance for many ancient peoples. In fact, for the Sumerians, beer was a vital part of their diet. In a time when clean water was hard to come by and food sources were limited, beer provided a safe and nutritious alternative. The fermentation process, which involved yeast and grains, created a drink rich in nutrients, including vitamins and minerals. Beer in ancient Sumer was often consumed by workers, laborers, and farmers as a way to stay hydrated and nourished throughout the day. It was considered a health tonic, particularly for those doing physical labor in the fields or construction sites. As we've seen, beer was even used in rituals to promote fertility and well-being, as it was believed to have restorative powers. But it's not just the Sumerians who thought of beer as a health drink. Other ancient cultures, including the Egyptians and the Greeks, shared similar beliefs. Historians have also noted that beer was often safer to drink than water in ancient times. Water sources could be contaminated, but the fermentation process made beer safer for consumption. Alcohol, even in small amounts, helped kill off harmful bacteria and pathogens, providing an important safeguard for ancient people. It's a striking thought, isn't it? That a simple drink, created thousands of years ago, served as both a nourishment and a shield for its consumers, helping to stave off illness in a world without modern medicine. In fact, it was the safety and sustenance offered by beer that made it such an important part of daily life. It was, as much as it was a religious or social beverage, a vital survival tool. It's no wonder that beer became such a central part of cultures worldwide. It was practical, reliable, and, in many ways, essential. The Sumerians, by recognizing the value of beer not just as a beverage but as a lifeline, laid the foundation for a cultural tradition that would last for millennia. Historians still argue whether the primary reason for beer's popularity was its social or its nutritional value. Some contend that beer's role in religious and social gatherings was a driving force behind its widespread adoption, while others emphasize the health benefits, particularly in societies where water quality was often poor. Perhaps it was a combination of both. Beer was a drink that was simultaneously sacred and practical, a drink that could nurture both the body and the spirit. Let's pause for a moment to think about the sheer significance of beer. In a world where beverages were often limited, beer was a drink that offered versatility. It could be used in religious ceremonies, shared at social gatherings, consumed for health benefits, and even traded as a commodity. It was so essential to ancient life that the Sumerians had a goddess for it, and their legal codes even had specific regulations regarding its production and sale. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was a key player in shaping the development of ancient societies. And let's not forget the brewing process itself. While the Sumerians may have been the first to create and refine beer, the knowledge of brewing spread like wildfire throughout the ancient world. Every civilization that adopted brewing put its own twist on the process, adding new ingredients, techniques, and flavors to create distinct regional varieties of beer. From the bitter ales of ancient Egypt to the flavorful brews of the Greeks, beer became a diverse and dynamic part of global culture. The brewing process itself became an art form, passed down through generations, improving over time as civilizations grew and evolved. This idea of beer as an evolving art is something we still see today. Modern brewers take inspiration from ancient recipes while also experimenting with new ingredients, new methods, and new flavors. The evolution of beer has come full circle, with ancient traditions blending with contemporary innovation. And in a way, we're still honoring those first Sumerian brewers who figured out how to harness the power of fermentation all those millennia ago. We may no longer brew beer in clay pots or offer it to the gods, but we still appreciate it as a symbol of community, craftsmanship, and culture. Even as we move into the 21st century, beer remains a drink that brings people together. Whether it's a casual evening with friends or a celebration of a special occasion, beer continues to play a role in social rituals and gatherings. The rituals may have changed, but the significance of beer hasn't. It still connects people, still nurtures them, and still brings them closer to the earth and to each other. As you sip your own beer, imagine the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians, all of them raising a glass, in their own time, to the gods, to each other, and to the simple joys of life. The same drink that they held in their hands is the one you hold now, an unbroken link to ancient times. Just as beer traveled across centuries and civilizations, so too does it continue to bring people together today. As we approach the end of our journey through the ancient origins of beer, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. From the Sumerians, who began brewing this transformative drink over 5,000 years ago, to the way beer traveled through ancient civilizations, leaving its mark on societies, rituals, and daily life, we've uncovered how much beer shaped human culture. The fact that a simple beverage, crafted from barley, water, and yeast, could have such a profound impact on human history is truly remarkable. While we've mostly discussed beer's influence on ancient civilizations, it's fascinating to think about how it has continued to evolve and impact our world today. The brewing techniques, ingredients, and the culture surrounding beer have only grown more intricate, but the fundamental spirit of the drink remains much the same. In a world constantly changing, the timeless act of sharing a beer with friends, enjoying a quiet moment, or toasting to a special occasion is something that ties us directly to our ancient ancestors. Today, beer is part of global culture. Whether it's a local craft brew, a mass-produced lager, or an experimental IPA, beer festivals, bars, breweries, and even home brewing are thriving in nearly every corner of the world. Modern brewers continue to experiment with flavors, ingredients, and techniques, but at its heart, beer remains a drink that invites people to slow down, socialize, and share stories. The modern beer industry might look very different from what the Sumerians envisioned, but in many ways, it still serves the same purpose, bringing people together. Whether shared in celebration, relaxation, or even during difficult times, beer fosters a sense of community. It's no surprise that after all these centuries, beer continues to be one of the most consumed drinks globally. Just as beer once played a central role in the life of the Sumerians, it still holds a special place in our hearts today. As you think about the role of beer in your own life, consider the journey it has made over thousands of years, from the ancient Sumerians to modern-day drinkers like you. The drink that once helped build cities, celebrated rituals, and nourished workers still brings people together, whether it's in a bustling pub or quiet backyard. And while today's beer may be a little more refined, its roots are still firmly planted in that ancient Sumerian brew, offering a small, comforting link to the past. Let's wrap up by slowing down a bit and reflecting on the cozy comfort that comes with history like this. Sipping a drink, just as the Sumerians did so long ago, can bring a sense of connection, not only to those ancient peoples but to the entire history of humankind. And with that thought, let's take a deep breath, close our eyes, and let the calm settle in. The next time you open a cold beer, remember that you are participating in a tradition that stretches back millennia, one that connects you with countless others across time and space. Now, as we prepare to drift off into the quiet of the night, let's remember that the Sumerians might have invented beer, but it was the shared joy of it across all cultures and times that made it last. Here's to beer, community, and the timeless enjoyment of a drink that's never really been just a drink. So, as you settle in, let your mind wander back to the ancient brewmasters of Sumer, the soft clink of clay mugs, and the flickering of oil lamps in those early Mesopotamian taverns. The world was a different place then, but the warmth and relaxation of a good drink, shared with others, is something that hasn't changed one bit.